"There's something I need to tell you," my brother said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." His voice had gone thin in the last weeks, worn down to something papery and effortful, but there was a different quality to it that morning, a steadiness underneath the weakness that I hadn't heard from him in months. I was sitting in the chair beside his hospital bed, the one I'd occupied most afternoons for the past 3 weeks, and I remember thinking, in the half-second before he continued, that I already knew what was coming. I thought he was finally going to apologize for 1987, for the business, for the money, for the 11 years afterward when we barely spoke. I had been waiting, in some quiet corner of myself, for that exact sentence for almost 4 decades. I leaned forward in the chair, ready to tell him it didn't matter anymore, that I'd long since let it go. I was wrong about what he was going to say. I was wrong in a way that I am still, weeks later, trying to find the bottom of. My brother's name was Daniel, 3 years older than me, which in the particular arithmetic of childhood had made him, for most of my early life, less a brother than a kind of weather system, present, large, occasionally generous, occasionally something to brace against. We grew up in a small house at the edge of a small town, the kind of place where everyone's families had known each other for generations, where the same dozen surnames showed up over and over on mailboxes and gravestones alike. Our father ran the hardware store on Main Street. Our mother kept the books for half the businesses in town, including his. Daniel was the kind of older brother other kids wanted as a friend, easy in a room, quick with a joke, the sort of charm that meant teachers forgave him things they wouldn't have forgiven me. I adored him in the uncomplicated way younger brothers adore the version of their siblings that exists before either of them is old enough to see the cracks. The cracks came later, the way they usually do, not a single dramatic break, but a slow accumulation, across decades, of small disappointments, and one large one. Daniel borrowed money from our parents in his 20s that he never quite paid back. He had a habit, well into his 30s, of charm that occasionally tipped into a kind of careless cruelty, the sort that wounds people who trusted him precisely because they trusted him. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular, when I was maybe 26, watching him hold an entire table of relatives in the palm of his hand with a story about a fishing trip, watching my own wife laugh at something he'd said, and feeling, underneath my own laughter, a small familiar ache, the specific ache of being the steady, dependable brother in a family that has always found the unsteady, undependable one more interesting to be around. I don't say that to excuse anything that came later. I say it because I think it's part of why what happened in 1987 cut as deep as it did. It wasn't only the money. It was the confirmation of something I'd half believed about him since childhood, finally proven in numbers I could hold in my hand. And then, in 1987, there was the business, a hardware supply venture the two of us had started together, using money I'd inherited from an aunt, money Daniel had access to as a co-signer on the account, money that disappeared over the course of about 18 months in ways neither of us, even now, has ever fully reconstructed to my satisfaction. I won't pretend the details matter as much now as they did then. What matters is that I lost a significant sum of money, lost it to my own brother's mismanagement or worse, and that the trust between us did not survive it. We spoke perhaps 4 times in the 11 years that followed. Funerals, mostly, the unavoidable occasions that even broken families can't quite escape. And then, in 1998, at our mother's funeral, something thawed, slowly, imperfectly, the way these things do among people who have run out of the energy required to stay angry. We were not close again, not in the way we'd been close as boys, but we became brothers in the practical sense. Phone calls a few times a year, a visit at Christmas, the ordinary maintenance of a relationship that had decided, without ever discussing it directly, to continue. He was diagnosed with lung cancer 14 months before that morning in the hospital room. A smoker for most of his life, a fact that had stopped surprising either of us by the time it caught up with him. And the last several weeks of his illness had brought us closer than we'd been at any point since we were boys sharing a bedroom in that small house at the edge of town. I drove the 2 hours to see him 3, sometimes 4 times a week. We talked about things we'd never talked about before, our father, our mother, the business, even, once, briefly, in a way that felt like the beginning of the apology I kept waiting for. I had decided, by that point, that whatever he eventually said about 1987, I was simply going to accept it. I'd had 30-some years to prepare an answer for that particular sentence. I had no answer prepared for what he actually said. "I need to tell you about Patty Doyle," he said. I sat very still in the chair. Patty Doyle was a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, though it was a name everyone in our town over a certain age still carried somewhere, The way small towns carry their unsolved griefs, quietly, persistently, brought up occasionally at reunions or in the local paper on significant anniversaries, never quite allowed to fully recede. Patty Doyle had been 17 in the summer of 1968, 2 years behind Daniel in school, a year ahead of me. She disappeared on a Saturday night in late July and was never found. There had been a search, dogs, volunteers combing the woods and the quarry for the better part of 2 weeks, a story that made the regional papers for a while, theories that circulated through the town for years afterward and never quite settled into anything resembling an answer. I remembered her face from the posters that had hung in the hardware store window for what felt, at the time, like an entire summer. I remembered my mother crying, once, unexpectedly, over the kitchen sink, when someone mentioned the Doyle family at church. I had not thought about Patty Doyle in any sustained way in decades. I had certainly never thought to connect her, in any way, to my brother. I was at the quarry that night, Daniel said. His eyes were on the ceiling, not on me. The way people sometimes look when they're delivering something they've rehearsed too many times in their own head to be able to say it while looking at another person's face. I never told the police that. I never told anyone that. Not your mother, not your father, not a single living soul, in 58 years. I asked him, carefully, what he meant. He told me there had been a group of them out there that night. 6 or 7 kids, 18 and 19 mostly. A few beers, the kind of unsupervised summer evening that was simply ordinary in a town like ours. Back then, with nothing remarkable about it until it became remarkable. He described the quarry the way I remembered it myself from my own teenage years. A few summers later, the particular mineral smell of the water, cold even in July a few feet below the surface, the rock ledge worn smooth by generations of kids jumping from roughly the same 3 spots, the way sound carried strangely out there at night, voices and laughter bouncing off the stone walls in a way that made the place feel both intimate and exposed at once. Patty had come with a boy named Russell Boyd, who Daniel said had been sweet on her most of that spring. There had been swimming, the way there always was at the quarry on a hot night, the deep water on the far side where the rock dropped away sharply, and the local kids all knew, supposedly, not to go without a clear head. He said it had gotten dark, properly dark, sometime around 10, and that the group had thinned out as people started drifting home or pairing off, and that by 11 it was down to just a handful, himself, Russell, Patty, and 2 others whose names he gave me but that I won't repeat here, because one of them is still alive, still in that town, and has built an entire life around the fact that none of this was ever traced back to him. There was an argument, Daniel said, between Russell and Patty. I don't remember what it was about, something small, the kind of thing that wouldn't matter at all except for what happened after. She got upset and went into the water alone, out past where any of us usually went, out toward the deep side, and I think she meant it as a kind of statement, the way kids do that age. Fine, watch me, I don't need any of you. And then she just didn't come back. He stopped there. I didn't say anything. I have learned, in the years since, that there are certain silences you don't fill, even when every instinct in you wants to. We waited, he said eventually. I don't know how long. It felt like 10 minutes. It was probably less. And then somebody, I think it was Russell, but I genuinely don't remember anymore. 58 years is a long time to keep a single night perfectly ordered. Somebody said her name, loud, into the dark, and there wasn't an answer, and that was when all of us understood, at the same moment, what had actually happened. I sat in that hospital chair and felt something go very still and very cold in my chest, a sensation I can only describe as the body recognizing, slightly ahead of the mind, that what's coming next is going to require more from you than you currently have available. What did you do? I said. It wasn't really a question. I think I already knew, somehow, that the answer wasn't going to be the one that would let any of us feel better about that night. We were drunk, Daniel said. Not falling down drunk, but drunk enough, at 18, to be terrified in a way that made us stupid instead of useful. None of us could swim well enough to go out to where she'd gone under. The deep side of that quarry was 40, 50 feet in places. Nobody our age went out there seriously. It was all bravado, showing off in the shallower parts close to the rock ledge. We yelled. We looked, for a while, along the edge, with the one flashlight someone had in a car. And then, he stopped again. I watched his hand, resting on top of the hospital blanket, tighten slightly around the fabric. And then Russell said we couldn't tell anyone. Not because, I want to be clear about this, because I've spent 58 years trying to be clear about it to myself. Not because any of us had done anything to her, not directly. Nobody pushed her. Nobody touched her. She went in on her own, upset, and the water did what the water did, and none of us had been responsible enough, sober enough, brave enough to go in after her in time. But we were 6 teenagers who'd been drinking, illegally, unsupervised, at a quarry we weren't supposed to be at, and Russell said, and God help me, the rest of us agreed with him in about 30 seconds, that if we told anyone, we'd be blamed for it, that nobody would believe it was an accident, that our lives would be over before they'd even started. So you left her there, I said. I heard my own voice say it, flat, and didn't recognize it entirely as mine. We made a pact, Daniel said. 6 of us. Never to tell. We agreed on a story, that we'd all gone home around 10 before anything happened, that we hadn't seen Patty at all that night except in passing earlier in the evening. We rehearsed it, actually rehearsed it, in someone's car before any of us went home. And then we went home, and 2 days later, when the town started searching, all 6 of us gave the same story to the police, and all 6 of us were believed, because we were good kids, from good families, and because nobody had any reason to doubt us. He paused. I have lived with that story being believed for 58 years. I have watched her parents search for her for the rest of their own lives. Both of them are long gone now. Neither one ever found out what happened to their daughter. And I have said nothing every single time it came up, every reunion, every anniversary article in the paper, every single time someone at church mentioned the Doyle family and how sad it still was, nobody ever really knowing. I sat in those conversations and I said nothing for 58 years. I didn't say anything for a long moment after that. I remember looking at the window, at the particular gray light of a hospital room in late afternoon, and thinking about my mother crying over the kitchen sink, decades ago, over a girl I'd half forgotten, and understanding, with a kind of sick vertigo, that my own brother had been sitting at that same kitchen table some evenings, while she cried, knowing exactly what had happened and saying nothing, not even to comfort her with a version of the truth that might have eased some part of the knot. Knowing, even if it couldn't bring Patty back. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. It came out harder than I meant it to, or maybe exactly as hard as I meant it to. Because I'm dying, he said. And because I've spent 58 years telling myself that the kindest thing, the only thing, was to let it stay buried, the way she's buried, somewhere in that water, in a part of the quarry nobody's ever properly searched because nobody ever had a reason to look there specifically. I told myself silence was protecting people, her parents, from a truth that wouldn't bring her back, the 5 of us, from consequences that wouldn't undo anything. This whole town, from having to relive something it had mostly managed to set down. I believed that, mostly for decades. I don't believe it anymore. I think I told myself that story because it let me keep living a life I wanted to keep living, and dying men don't get to keep telling themselves convenient stories. I needed to say it to someone before I go. I needed it to exist outside of just my own head, finally, after 58 years of it being only mine. I sat with him for a long time after that, not speaking. I want to say I asked him the right questions, said the right things, but the truth is that for a long stretch I simply sat there, in the chair I'd occupied for 3 weeks, looking at my brother, 81 years old, weeks from death, the boy I'd adored at 6 years old somehow contained inside this same failing body, and feeling something I didn't have a clean name for. Not quite anger, though there was anger in it. Not quite grief, though grief was in it too, layered over the grief I was already carrying for him. Something closer, I think, to the specific vertigo of discovering that a person you have known your entire life contains an entire room you never knew was there, and that the room has been occupied, the whole time, by something you would never have imagined him capable of holding. I thought, sitting there, that this was the whole of it, the confession, complete, the worst thing he had to tell me finally told. I began, almost reflexively, the way you do when a difficult conversation seems to have reached its natural end, to think about what came next, whether I would tell anyone, whether I even could, what obligation I now carried as the only other living person who knew. I was already, in some part of my mind, starting to fold this away, the way you fold away something enormous because you have to put it somewhere in order to keep functioning. Daniel wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said, and something in his voice made me go still again, because I recognized, even then, that whatever was coming next had been the harder thing to say all along. The thing the rest of the confession had been a kind of run-up toward. I know where she is. Not exactly. I'm not going to pretend I could walk you to a precise spot. 58 years on, the quarry's changed, parts of it filled in differently after the flooding in the 90s. But I know roughly where, on that ledge, she went under, and I know the general area of the deep side where the current there tends to pull things, because I went back. Once, about 6 years after it happened, when I'd finally saved enough money and gotten certified to dive. I told everyone it was a hobby, which it became, eventually, genuinely. But the reason I learned to dive in the first place was so I could go back to that quarry, alone, and look for her myself. I asked him what he'd found. Nothing, he said, or nothing I could be certain of. The visibility down there is terrible, even with a good light. The bottom's silt, it clouds the second you disturb anything. And I only had maybe 40 minutes of air and the nerve to do it twice. 2 separate weekends, 6 years apart, before I couldn't make myself go back a third time. I found, he stopped. His hand tightened again on the blanket. I found a shoe, down near the base of the ledge, half buried in silt. A girl's shoe, the right size, the right era, badly deteriorated but still recognizably what it was. I have never been certain it was hers. I've spent 40-some years not being certain, on purpose, because being certain would have meant I had to do something about it, and I'd already decided, by then, that I wasn't going to. Where is it? I asked. The shoe. He told me, and I want to say that when he told me, something in the room seemed to contract, the way air contracts before a storm. He had kept it. For over 40 years, in a small wooden box at the back of his workshop, wrapped in a cloth, sitting in his garage less than 2 hours from where we were sitting at that exact moment. My brother had kept a single shoe that he believed, without being able to prove it even to himself, belonged to a 17-year-old girl who had been missing for 58 years, whose parents had died never knowing, whose name was still spoken, occasionally, with a particular quiet sadness, at reunions and in church and in brief anniversary articles in the regional paper that nobody outside our town would ever read. I want you to do something with it that I never could, he said. I don't know what. I've thought about it more times than I can count. Give it to her remaining family. There's a niece somewhere, I believe, who still lives in the area. Give it to the police, even now. Even though I don't know what good it would do at this point beyond confirming what nobody can fully confirm. Or simply put it somewhere closer to where it actually belongs, if that means anything, which I'm not sure it does. I never could decide. I've had over 40 years and I never could decide. And I think that not deciding is its own kind of cowardice. The same cowardice that kept me silent in the first place, just dressed up as patience. I'm not asking you to forgive me for any of it. I don't think that's mine to ask for. I'm asking you to decide what I never could, because I'm out of time to keep not deciding, and because you're the only person left who I trust to actually do something, instead of just carrying it quietly the way I did. I didn't say anything for a long time. Eventually, I asked him about the other 4, the friends who'd made that pact with him 58 years ago, in the front seat of a car. He told me 2 were dead. One had moved away decades earlier, and he'd lost track of entirely. The last one, Russell, the boy Patty had been arguing with, the one who'd first said they couldn't tell, was, as far as Daniel knew, still alive, still in town, 80 years old now. A man I realized I almost certainly knew at least by sight. Had probably nodded to in passing at the hardware store or the post office over the years without any idea what I was nodding at. Does he know you're telling me this? I asked. Daniel shook his head, slowly, the motion costing him something visible. We made a pact never to tell, and as far as I know, the rest of them have kept it exactly the way I kept it, for 58 years. I have no idea what Russell carries, day to day. We were never close again after that summer. I think neither of us could stand to look at the other one for very long without seeing the whole thing. I'd see him occasionally, at the grocery store, at some town function, and we'd nod, the way you described just now, and that would be it. I used to wonder, sometimes, whether he thought about her as much as I did, or whether he'd found some way to set it down completely. I never had the nerve to ask him. I'm not sure I want you to ask him either, though I understand that's not really my decision to make anymore. Daniel died 9 days later. I was not in the room when it happened. I'd gone home to sleep for the first time in nearly a week, and the hospital called at 4 in the morning, and by the time I got back he was already gone. I sat with him for a while afterward, in the particular stillness of a hospital room after someone has died, and I thought about the shoe in the wooden box in his garage, and about Patty Doyle's face on a poster in our father's hardware store window, 58 summers ago, and about my mother crying over the kitchen sink for a reason I never understood until 3 weeks before my brother's death. I drove to his house the following week to begin going through his things, a task that has become, this past year, a strange and recurring feature of my life, sorting through the physical remainder of people I've loved. I found the box exactly where he'd said it would be, at the back of the workshop, behind a row of paint cans that looked as though they hadn't been moved in years. I unwrapped the cloth carefully, the way you'd unwrap something you weren't certain you wanted to actually see, And there it was, small, deteriorated, the leather gone stiff and dark with age and water damage. A single shoe that might have belonged to a girl who vanished in 1968, or might, possibly, have belonged to no one significant at all, lost in a quarry the way things are sometimes simply lost, with no story attached. I will likely never know for certain which of those two things is true. I don't think Daniel ever knew either. I think that not knowing, carried for over 40 years, was its own particular punishment, perhaps crueler in its way than certainty would have been. I have not yet decided what to do with it. I think about Russell Boyd, 80 years old, still in our town, and I think about whether he carries this the way my brother carried it, or whether he found some way to set it down that Daniel never managed, or whether, and this thought sits uneasily with me, he has simply never thought about that night again in 58 years, the way some people manage to fold things away so completely they cease to exist at all. I think about the niece Daniel mentioned, somewhere in the area, who as far as I know has spent her entire life with an aunt who simply disappeared, an absence with no shape to it, no answer, just a hole in a family tree that never closed. I don't know what it would mean to hand her a single deteriorated shoe and an account, secondhand now, from a dead man, of a night nobody else who's still alive will likely ever confirm. I keep the box on a shelf in my own garage now, wrapped in the same cloth, exactly as I found it. I take it down sometimes and look at it, the way I imagine Daniel must have, on certain anniversaries, for over 40 years, not often, not as a ritual exactly, but enough that I notice myself doing it, reaching for it on evenings when I can't quite say what drew me to the shelf in the first place. I think about my brother at 18, in the dark, at the edge of that water, frozen by fear into a decision that shaped the rest of his life, and the rest of at least one other family's life, without him ever fully choosing it so much as failing to choose anything else in time. I don't think I can forgive him for the 58 years of silence. I also don't think I can fully condemn the 18-year-old boy who made one terrified, catastrophic decision in the dark and then spent the rest of his life half trying, in private, broken ways, to make some kind of amends he could never quite bring himself to make completely. Both of those things are true about my brother. I'm still learning how to hold them at the same time. I think, too, about the version of Daniel I knew before that hospital room. The older brother who held a Thanksgiving table in the palm of his hand, the one who borrowed money he never paid back, the one I'd spent decades quietly measuring myself against, and quietly resenting for being the more interesting of the two of us. I find that I can no longer think about that version of him without also thinking about the other one, the 18-year-old standing at the edge of dark water with 4 other terrified teenagers, agreeing to a lie that would outlive nearly everyone who told it. I don't know how to fold those two men into a single understanding of who my brother actually was. I'm not certain that's even possible, or that it's the right goal. Maybe some people simply contain more than one true thing, and the work left to the rest of us isn't to resolve the contradiction, but to learn to carry it the way they did, unresolved, ongoing, never quite set down. I drove past the quarry last month, for the first time in years. They've fenced part of it off now, put up signs, the kind of safety measures that didn't exist when Daniel and Russell and Patty and the others were 18 and certain of their own invincibility. I sat in my car at the edge of the access road for a while, looking at the water through the chain link, gray and still in the afternoon light, and I thought about a girl I never really knew, 2 years older than me in school, whose face I half remember from a poster in my father's hardware store window, 58 summers gone now. I didn't get out of the car. I'm not sure what I would have done if I had. I just sat there for a while, and then I drove home, the way my brother must have driven home that night in 1968, except that I had nothing to carry back with me except the knowledge of what he'd carried, and even that felt, in that moment, like almost more than I knew how to hold. The shoe is still on the shelf. I haven't called anyone, not the niece, not the police, not Russell Boyd, whose name and address I now have, sitting in a drawer, should I ever decide I'm ready to use them. Some evenings I think I'm close to deciding. Other evenings I think I'm exactly where my brother was, for over 40 years, looking at the same small wooden box and not yet ready to find out what it costs to finally put it down.